How's everybody doing today on this beautiful Saturday morning? Oh my goodness. It is July in the Berkshires, and I always think I'm a winter kind of gal, but I love this weather. So it's a really warm day today, and I am excited to spend a few minutes inside with you guys. Um, let's see. Holler out if you are um, if you are out there with me. Let me know where you are, what's your location. I'm excited to talk to you today we're going to talk about the hand sewing technique that I use, the needles that I use, and then the sewing material and how to make sure that you're optimizing your tools and materials to make it fun and not frustrating, and also when you're having, hey Reed, how are you? um, when you have fun making crafts of any kind and you have the right tools, then your frustration level diminishes and you have this opportunity to really flourish in the process. So that's what this is all about today. um, so to get started with, for anybody who's new out there and just learning about me for the first time, my name is Christina French. It's a little weird. My business is also the same as my first name. Um, and I was actually born in Ireland, so French is kind of a more typical Irish spelling that you would see with like the boy's name Aaron, Aaron, or sometimes you see Lloyd spelled with two L's. And that's an old Irish tradition, so I can talk more about that another time. But today, my name is Christina French, and I am a textile recycling artist, an environmental activist, and an empowerment coach. And I love to empower people through my process of making with recycled clothing to empower people to find a hand making process that they love. And the confidence that that builds in someone's life is quite notable. And not only does it build confidence, but you are able to kind of let your worry, stress, and fear subside, which is all great, especially right now with the world in the sort of sideways tailspin that we're experiencing. So, today we're going to, um, hmm, okay, I'll show you. We talked about this guy yesterday. This is the very first product that I ever made. This is a little stuffed toy. It's called a ragamuffin. And just to give you guys an idea of what I do, I make blankets, rugs, clothing, all kinds of stuff, and I'll be talking more about that as my 30-day Live at 11 series continues. But today we're going to talk about sewing and hand sewing specifically. So this is a little square that I made for a blanket, a collaborative blanket called a Stitulon blanket, which we'll talk more about it. Maybe we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But the Stitch-Along blanket squares were made by women who joined me in the collaboration all across the country and actually across the world. We had a couple Canadians, a couple people over in the UK. And these pieces are all cut from old clothing. The background piece was initially a blanket, an old wool blanket that I found somewhere along the line. And then these little pieces are all cashmere sweater bits. And then the stitching that you see here is done with embroidery floss. The piece in the middle right here is vintage an embroidery, and that was I did not embroider that little flower. It came and it's actually an iron-on, and those come from a really cool shop. If you guys are interested in this kind of work, you can find more things like that. It's called Vintage Groove, and it's on Etsy. So check that out. Hi, Anne. How are you today? I'm so glad you're here. So check out Vintage Groove if you're interested in sourcing any kind of like little bits and bobbles for your sewing projects. It's run by my friend Jill, and she's on Etsy. Just going to put that in the comments for you guys. It's a really great resource. She has amazing antique little bits and bobbles and really cool, interesting things. So one of the things that I find with students is that they oftentimes have lots of questions about how to make the sewing process fun and and enjoyable and also easy, like on your hands. So I have a bunch of tools here that I use. These are called yarn darners, and these are very sharp points and a nice big fat eye in the needle. And those work really well with wool yarn. I use wool. You can use whatever kind of yarn you might have kicking around. Um, so the thing that works really nicely about them is that they're kind of heavy. So when I thread a heavy sewing material through them, the eye accommodates a wide piece of material, which is a really important factor when you're choosing the right size needle to use. And then when you pull your yarn and your needle, the bulk of the thickness of the shaft, first I got to tell you something. I'm going to interrupt myself for 1 second. I have a tattoo on my finger that's a mustache. Can you see it? So if you're wondering what that thing on my finger is, I need to get it redone. It's really, really old. But, you know, when my son was little, he thought that was super groovy. So anyway, when you're pulling your material, the shaft of the needle should be around about the same thickness as the material that you're sewing with, so that when you're pulling it through the material, the needle's actually making a pathway to pull your yarn or your thread through. So the yarn darners work really well with yarn, hence the yarn darner name. And then we have embroidery needles, and let me just show you the comparison of these two. Hold on, let me just, okay, so this is a yarn darner. Wait, hold on. There's a yarn darner, and this is an embroidery needle. So quite a bit smaller eye, also very sharp pointed. And these are ideal for using with embroidery floss. And this is a little pack of embroidery floss. I have embroidery floss in my shop, and I introduce a new palette each season. So right now you'll find the summer 2020 palette in the shop. And it's kind of, they come in these little envelopes. This is like a place where you can stick your needles when you're you know, not using them, or if you have them threaded up already. So it's a nice little needle keeper. And then inside of here are the colors of the season. So let's start. I want to use a color that you can see really well because the quality of my connection is not always great. So embroidery floss is kind of a conundrum for a lot of people. It comes in these beautiful colors. I think there's over 400 colors available from my favorite company, which is called DMC, and it's actually made in England. And it's the kind that you buy at like Joann Fabrics or Michael's or wherever, and they, you know, it comes in a sea of like yummy colors. And you get it home and there's these cute little skeins, and then you say, well, how the heck am I supposed to get that out without making a giant mess of the thing? And there's two ends. There's usually one end that's a little bit longer, like this end right here. Can you see it? There's one end. And then there's another end here that's usually kind of tucked inside next to the paper label. So if you find the longer end and give it hold the skein kind of in your hand that way, so you're kind of supporting the whole length of it, and just pull. Now watch, I'm doing this in front of, you know, the wild world of Facebook is hopefully won't tangle. Okay, so you're just going to pull that end straight out of your pack. Okay, and lo and behold, it's actually working really well. So yes, the other thing that I think is important to consider is when you're sewing, you want to have your sewing material be a comfortable length to pull through. So you don't want to have it be so long that you have to go back and pull it twice, and you don't want to have it be so short that you have to stop and start a bunch of times. So usually what I do is I pull it out from like the length of my arm with a little extra tail, because that's going to be through the needle. So the needle will probably rest right about where my fingers are. And that way you know that you have a nice long length to get going with, and you also have, you know, a short enough piece to not have to stop and start a bunch, or not have to pull it through twice. So I'm just going to reach for my scissors. Excuse me 1 second. Okay, here are my scissors, and we talked about these the other day. If anybody's interested, I did a little Live at 11 segment on scissors specifically and cutting tools. These are fantastic little, very sharp scissors. They're made by the Ernest Wright Company. And so here's my length of floss. Now, most of you might know, but just in case there's anybody out there who's new to all of this stuff, Embroidery floss comes in what they call 6 ends. So there's 6 little pieces of thread that are all kind of bound together in one piece of yarn. So again, the video quality from my little rural studio in the Berkshire Hills of Western Massachusetts makes clarity of image a little questionable sometimes, but I'm hoping you can see that clearly. So do you see how there's 6 ends there? So with embroidery floss, you can separate that as much as you want. You can separate it down to 2 or 3 or 1, whatever. You can just take one out if you want it to be a little thinner than how it comes packaged. And you can also sew with all 6. So it's really just your preference and how much of the material you want to, how much of that embroidery floss do you want to see? Are you embroidering something where you want to fill in a big space? If that's the case, you probably want to run with the whole 6 strands. If you're embroidering something super fine and you're going really tiny little stitches on something like, you know, tiny linen or counted cross stitch, you're going to divide it and maybe just even use 1 strand. But regardless, one of the things that I found super helpful about sewing with embroidery floss is waxing your floss. And I have these little cakes of, I use beeswax. So this is a little sewer's cake of beeswax, and can you see there's a little bee emblem on it with a little beehive, and it just smells like super divine. So I have one of these that I've used a bunch around here. Let me see if I can put my hand on it quick. I have to tell you that before I joined you here this morning, I was out in my garden, so I'm a little bit like not really, hold on. Here it is. I got it. Okay, so after a while, after you use these for a little bit, can you see they get a little, you know, you can see where I pull the thread through the wax. So the trick is to hold your thread, and you're going to just put your thumb down on the cake, and you're going to just pull it through. This is called loving your thread. And the reason why this is a really helpful step of the process is because it keeps your thread from tangling, and it also allows you to thread your needle more easily, because it's kind of, it almost, you know how dental floss has that kind of, it's just a little bit more, I don't know the right word, it's more like stiff, so it's easier to thread your needle. Okay, so I'm going to grab an embroidery needle here. Can you see it? There we go. Okay, and I'm just going to cut my thread, and I cut it right down. I'm just going to hold this right up to the camera if I can figure out. Okay, there we go. Do you see how that thread is cut right down to my finger? And I'm just going to pull it into between my finger and my thumb so that it's really close to the crease of my finger. And I'm going to take the needle eye, and I'm actually just going to work that needle eye right over the top of those cut ends, and God willing, I'll be able to thread this really quick right in front of you guys. I think I got it. Maybe not. There's one piece that's a little, one piece is giving me a bit of a hard time, so I'm just going to trim off that end and see if I show you my trick again. Okay, so right down in between, you can barely even see it. So I'm going to pinch my fingers even more over it, and then I'm just going to run my needle back and forth over those ends. There we go. Okay, so there you have it. And again, the shaft of this needle matches the weight of that string pretty nicely. So when I go to sew through something that is heavy and maybe a few layers thick, this is going to make a little pathway through the material and make it easy to pull the yarn or this floss through. Okay. So I just want to, oh, Helen Murphy, you're watching me from Kinvara. How are you, darling? I must be in there with you guys. It's typical that my family and I travel to Kinvara in County Galway, Ireland in the summer, and we usually go every other year or try to get there as often as we can, and that's like my homeland. And right now, being that I live in the United States, I can't travel to Europe. We're not allowed to. They won't take us because, you know, Corona. So it's so nice to have you here, Helen. Thank you. Please send my love around to all the friends there. How are you guys doing? Does anybody have any questions? Okay, I'm just going to keep going. So floss and yarn, let me look at that. We have kind of matching stuff today. Floss and yarn are not so typical for what people normally sew when they're home doing hand sewing or mending that I think a lot of people wind up finding sewing through mending. So, you know, your button pops off and, you know, what do? You're going to sew it back on. So this is a more typical type of thread. This is actually it's a little bit more typical, but I buy these tubes because they have a lot of thread on them rather than something like this, which is more of just like a spool that doesn't have as much yardage on it. Here's another one. This is a button, buttons and carpet thread, so it's a little heavier weight than this. So my trick about thread is that I really enjoy, I like using natural fibers. So this thread, which is kind of my standby, I have this in I don't know how many different colors. It's 100% cotton, and it's called 3-cord cotton thread. And I bought this at Joann Fabrics. So it is available there in a limited amount of colors. Like the different colors I've had for years, and I ordered it in bulk from places that I bought from when I had my big production company. So I'm not sure what will happen when I run out, but thankfully I have a lot of thread. So again, you're going to cut your thread the same kind of length, you know, arm's length, a little extra. And then your threading, your needle is going to be different depending upon what you're stitching. Okay, so this needle is kind of an all-around sort of hand sewing needle, great for buttons, great for, you know, you need to hem something. It's all this kind of standard. It's got a kind of a, let me see, a kind of large size eye for the, you know, it's a long eye, and it's kind of fine. The needle's kind of fine, and it's easy to thread because of that eye. And there it is. And now here, when we're looking at the size of this needle shaft versus the thread, the shaft is actually wider than the thread, so it's going to be super easy for sewing. But the thing you need to consider is if you're sewing a very fine fabric, say a silk or something that's a really thin kind of watery material, you probably are going to want to find a thinner needle than this, okay? Because you want it's kind of, there's like a three-way kind of matching system that you use when you're hand sewing. You want to have the material that you're sewing with, your thread, yarn, or floss, your needle, and your fabric all kind of work nicely together, play nice together. So for the finer silks and more kind of thinner, you know, even if you're working with like linen is a super forgiving fabric, but if you're working with like a fine cotton or a knit that you're working, you know, you're hemming or whatever, you do want to find something tiny, tiny, like see that little tiny needle? And the eye in that one is really little. So that's kind of like general practice, like all around, you know, hand sewing stuff. I want to show you some specialty needles that I have here, which are super fun to check out. Look at this needle. This is for the upholstery industry. So it's used to, you know, when you tie through like a mattress or whatever, you can stitch through it with something that long. I actually use this. What's that called? I can't remember. I'm not thinking of the word right now, but there's a word for it when you actually, you know, you stitch down 2 stitches next to each other, down and then back up, and then you tie it. So this is really great for that. And you can find these, I got them online. I can't remember now where I bought them, but upholstery supply places will carry stuff like that. There's, this is a felting needle, which is completely, you know, not used for sewing, but used for needle felting, which is a cool process that my daughters are super into. They're very, very sharp, so really easy to hurt yourself if you're not familiar with the process. Really take it slow, or even like, I don't know, wear gloves or something. So let's see, what else do I have here? I have another needle that I'm just trying to find. I have a needle that is a very long yarn darner, which is great for sewing. Like if you're doing a lot of stitches, oh, here it is. This is this is the kind of typical yarn darner needle that I sell in my shop. And then this is the special long one that I'm actually thinking of adding to my shop because they're super useful for my process. And the place that you find this most useful is if you're doing like a running stitch. Like I make sweaters, and actually I'm working on sweaters now for fall and winter, and I'll do a little segment here on the sweater constructions and like what's going on with that. But if you're using a running stitch, which I use quite often with my sweater construction, and you want to go through and make a lot of stitches at once. When you have a nice long needle, you're able to really pack the stitches right on there. Do you see how that is? So then when you pull it through, you're pulling it through less often. So if you're real interested in taking this process and making it yours and taking it to the next level where you're actually producing things to sell, it's nice to have tools that make that as efficient as possible. I have not heard of someone Reed here is asking if I've used Wawak. It looks like is the name of a sewing supply company in Nevada. I have not. That sounds like a really great resource. Thanks for posting it there. You guys check that out. She says great threads and selection and prices. So those are, it's always, I'm all about tips and people's other experience. The other thing that I'm just going to mention while I'm here is that there's, I didn't bring a cone in with me, but there are threads that are specifically made for sergers. And they're generally a lighter weight thread that's like a polyester finish, so that when you're serging, a serger is a machine that uses anywhere from 3 to 5 threads together to make like the seam that you might see on the inside of a t-shirt that looks kind of knitted almost. That thread is really great for sergers. It works really well, and because there's so much thread that comes through a serger, it's nice to have it be lightweight so it doesn't create like a super heavy and bulky seam. It's not great for hand sewing. And actually there's quite a bit, while we're on the subject, there's quite a bit of yarn out there, like the hand spun single ply yarn that you'll see. If you don't know what I'm talking about, let me know and I'll be able to clarify that for you. But any kind of single ply knitting yarn is not really designed for sewing, and it will kind of pull apart as you're sewing and it becomes frustrating. So this yarn is called Tapestry Yarn. And this yarn that I use a lot, the yellow yarn, is called Persian wool yarn. And I used to sell yarn from my shop, but I stopped doing it just because it was hard to inventory enough colors for everyone's color choices. And I feel like it's easy to find. So you can look around. The best thing in the world is yarns.com, or maybe, no, it's just yarn, single, not plural. Yarn.com is Webs. And Webs has, they're the biggest yarn store, like I think in the world, and they're like 45-minute drive from my house. Oh. So I have to really be careful. If I get over there too often, I wind up with way too much stuff. But they have a great selection, and they have some nice wool sewing yarns that you'll find in there. It's called Valley Yarns. They're kind of in-house collection of yarns, and they do a bunch that are, you'll see, you'll just want whatever colors you're interested in, and you know, multiple ply. So if anybody has any questions, please shout them out. If you want to get started just playing around with some stitching, the thing that I really, really love about my process is that it's easy to get started with really very few tools and not a lot of equipment. So if you have an old blanket kicking around, or sometimes your old wool blankets that haven't been used in years, they've been sitting in the closet for a while, take a little strip off of it. Make yourself these squares are super fun. These are sample squares I did from the Stitulon. And I think I'm going to frame them. I think I'm going to put them in little frames and maybe pop them in my shop, because they're really fun, and you can get some really, we did the blanket stitch here on the edge. This is all embroidery floss. So, this is them beaded in the middle, and that is also, it came like that. I just stitched it down. It was one also from Vintage Groove. And then, a bunch of different little stitches that I tried around here, and French knots up, nope, it's on the side, French knots over here, and these little leaves here are embroidered, and the ones down here are appliqued. So it's a good way, little tiny pieces of fabric work, and you can kind of get started with some kind of little creative project. And if you run into questions, or you have concerns, or you're not sure how to get started, tune back in tomorrow, put me a question. I check my messages often, and would be happy to kind of walk you through any glitches that you come upon. So thank you so much for tuning in with me today. I hope you have a really lovely weekend. Get outside if you can, if you live in a place where that's a safe thing to do. I feel very lucky that I live in a rural, like, you guys don't even know. I live on a dirt road, off a dirt road. It's a through road. It's a really old road. It was a stagecoach road at one point. And I don't wear a mask all that often, but sometimes when I go to town, I realize how much I'm removed from the whole COVID lifestyle, and my heart goes out to people who are dealing with that with their everyday and kind of like every minute of every day. So um, get outdoors if you can. And if you can't get outdoors, use your creativity this weekend and find a little joy there. And come back and visit me again. I'll be here every day at 11 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, and for today's day number 6, so 24 more days, and I look forward to seeing your face around here again. Thanks so much. Bye.